Election 2024. It's not enough to know which politicians you trust. You got to know what polls to believe. Henry Olsen is here to break it down. I'm James Poulos. This is Zero Hour. Yes, Henry Olsen's here with us today. He's a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and he studies and commentates on American politics. An analyst, not a pollster. Henry, welcome.
Thank you for having me, James.
All right, so just quickly cue up what's the difference here. You're not the guy out in the field talking to people. You are absorbing all the information and trying to make heads or tails of it.
The pollster is the person who puts together the questionnaire, pulls the sample, runs the numbers, and puts it out. I've done that in my life, but I don't do that now. I analyze the polls.
All right, so let's dig in. I thought that polls are supposed to be obsolete. You know, a lot of people had a bad 2022 or sort of predictions were flying, didn't pan out, really contributed to that feeling that shenanigans were running rampant across the country, however you want to interpret that. Did you go through that process, and what did you learn about how to make sense of the polls?
You know, the thing is that you have to understand what polls are. Polls are not going into the doctor's office and the doctor gives you with what you expect to be like 98% accuracy, exactly what's ailing you and how to treat it. Polls talk about directions as margins of error, and we can get into how they're constructed. What you want to do is you want to get a sense of where the race is heading. And the fact is that what a problem with the polls in 2022, to the extent there was one, was that there was a late break away from candidates. There was a late break in the last weekend away from Republicans and towards Democrats. Polls are not going to catch that because they're in the field before the last weekend. I just think if you understand what polls can tell you and what they can't tell you, you're a lot less worried about what's going on. I got 2016 largely right because I knew how to read the polls, which is say seriously, but not literally.
If you're just a regular, ordinary American person who is recognizing that they have to care more about the numbers going into the home stretch, if they want any kind of clear picture of what's going on, where do you look? How do you know that the information that you are putting in front of your own face is true, is accurate enough?
Yeah, the thing is that what you should not do is put your faith in any one particular pollster. Every poll today is basically a constructed model, and that's because you can't get a random sample. Certain types of people are likelier to respond to polls, certain people are less likely. So every poll, it takes the survey data and matches it to what the pollster believes, or usually with good reason, to be what the likely electorate is like. There's no pollster who has the multi-year record of saying, oh, they always get it right. So look at the averages and understand that if they say it's, H plus 1 or T plus 1, you could easily be off by a point. There's no way to get it any closer than that. So you look at the direction, look at the average, and that's the best way to consume the polls.
I thought maybe you would say that people should just read your analysis and that's it, and they'll be fine.
But the thing is, my analysis can reflect that uncertainty.
Yeah.
One of my favorite sayings is from Lord of the Rings, where Sam's talking to the elves on the way to Rivendell, and it says, go not to the elves for advice, for they'll tell you both yes and no. I'll tell you yes or no the weekend before election, and I'm almost always right. But until then, you have to be willing to say there's a degree of uncertainty, and you have to be willing to say that things can change. Right now, it looks like Harris is slightly in the lead, but not by enough that anybody should place comfort in that, which is why the Harris side is talking about all her weaknesses, because she knows that this is a jump ball election and that movements of tenths of a point can be the difference between victory and defeat.
Yeah, okay. I mean, it seems to me that it's really a fool's errand to try to follow things day by day here. It's like the stock market. If you just watch the number go up and down every second, you're going to go crazy. But just taking sort of like a longer view, or maybe a broader view, if Harris is up or is running about neck and neck with Trump, then why is this campaign acting like they're in meltdown mode?
Because, first of all, when you're talking about tenths of a point, it's better to be acting like in meltdown mode than not. Secondly, she's been losing some altitude. If you were looking earlier in October, you were looking somebody who's maybe 2.5 to 3.5 points ahead. Well, in a winner-take-all scenario in the Electoral College, that gives you just a little bit more room for comfort. She's not there right now. Has lost some altitude, so they're just freaking out because the alternative to freak out is complacency, and you better be freaking than complacent when your candidate is losing a little bit of altitude and bringing it into the zone where, hey, if this keeps up, we are going to lose.
So when in doubt, freak out. This
Yeah.
is a campaign that has conspicuously not run on policy. Maybe not the first to kind of drift away from policy and talk about sort of larger themes or whatever, but it does seem like it's been at least a choice of some kind,
Yeah.
maybe motivated by kind of what the campaign has to work with in terms of the candidate. But really, it seems like it's difficult to run polls, to analyze polls, to assess the performance of a candidate who you can't kind of go to voters and say, well, what do you think about their stance on X?
But, the thing that unites the Democratic Party is no longer the natural majority party in the country. The only thing that gets them to a national majority is opposition to Trump, which means the more specific they are, the more they alienate part of their coalition. They go and lean too far to the center, and the left says, hey, that's not good enough for us. We'll vote for Jill Stein. We'll vote for Cornel West. We'll stay home. Tilt to the left, and the Republican-leaning independents who may not be crazy about Trump say, hey, that's too crazy. I'll hold my nose and vote for Trump. So that's why they're doing this. The only thing that unites their coalition is vibes and an opposition to Trump. And I expect to see that, not specific stances on policy, to dominate the Harris narrative in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, but even that kind of opposition looks like it's starting to become unreliable. You look at, men across all categories, across all sort of racial and ethnic categories. Definitely problems here. Harris, not appealing, and that kind of the danger factor that they've tried to hang around Trump for so long, that seems to be watering down.
The thing about the danger factor is people have already factored that in. The people who are motivated by he's a purported threat to democracy are already in Harris's camp. That they think that in 2022 that brought undecideds into their corner, and I think they might be right, but 2024 is not 2022. There's an extra 2 years of Biden-Harris. People still don't like the direction, and when the president's on the ballot, as opposed to faceless Congress people are more likely to cast a ballot as a referendum on the incumbent. 2022, the incumbent wasn't on the ballot. 2024, the incumbent is on the ballot because Harris is part of the administration. That means it's a lot tougher to run that be afraid of big orange man campaign because, as the Trump campaign always points out, hey, by the way, you've had power for the last few years. How do you like the last 4 years? And they can't run away from that. It's harder for them to do, even though they're trying to do it.
Yeah. So as Orange Man seems less bad and people get more used to Trump being around, I mean, he's been in the spotlight the whole time. It has been interesting to see these kind of dilemmas start to emerge out of the Harris campaign when they do have to turn to sort of policy matters. And I think, what's going on with Israel is a case in point. I mean, they seem to be in danger, at least, of backing themselves into this corner where they're not satisfying Muslim and Arab voters in, for instance, Michigan, but they're also not satisfying a big chunk of Jewish voters too. And it's almost like they're getting it from both directions.
That is exactly what the polls are saying is, again, it's not a huge defection. Harris will still win Jewish voters. She will still win Muslim voters. But the polls are showing that she's losing margin among both groups. And, again, she's not in charge of the policy. Biden's in charge of the policy, but she's obviously echoing it. And this half of one, half a dozen of the other is alienating certain people in both groups. And this is going to be a problem in Michigan, where they're mostly of the same size. But it's going to be really a problem in Pennsylvania, where Jews are 4 or 5% of the voting population. It's not huge, but if your margin is down by 10 points, and you're talking about tenths of a percent, that's votes that you're leaving on the table. But if she goes in one direction, the progressives and the Muslims get upset and she loses more votes in the other direction. She's just caught betwixt and between, and neither she nor the Biden administration have figured out that they need to pick a side and take it. And instead, they're losing in both directions.
Yeah, intersectionality, Rainbow Coalition stuff looks really persuasive on paper. Like, oh, yeah, we'll just sort of ban it. But in practice, it's turning out to not be quite so straightforward.
Yeah, well, the thing is that people want presidents to lead. They don't want presidents to assemble coalitions and ameliorate differences. But Biden spent his whole career ameliorating differences. Biden's superpower politically is that for 50 years, he's been able to effortlessly figure out where the center of the Democratic coalition is and occupy it. That's great if you want to be acceptable to everybody, but that's not what a president does. A president takes a position, brings people to that position. Biden is conspicuously unable to do it. Harris seems to be unable to do it too. And if people want leadership, if in the last stretch, as people are making up their minds, not crazy about either person, who do I trust more, those people tend to want leadership, and that means they're likelier to be flipping to Trump in the last week.
It's almost like a live by identity politics, die by identity politics thing, because, one interpretation of what's going on in Michigan, Pennsylvania, other states is it is kind of the Israel thing. But another interpretation is it's actually just the sex or gender thing, where Harris is not appealing to men. You look at the gender gap, it's enormous. This isn't, it's not just an America thing. You look around other parts of the world. I mean, I think in South Korea, the political gender gap is even more enormous. How much longer can that kind of differential exist without it really starting to do serious damage to the Democrats?
Yeah, well, the thing is, it's an equal and opposite reaction thing, is that all the polls in the United States show that over the last few years, young women are moving conspicuously to the left. Well, young women at that age group are about half the potential voters. You don't get the female advantage until, the older, because men die earlier. That's why women are 52% of the electorate, because there's a lot more 85 to 90-year-old women than there are men. And you have men turning more conservative. So the Democrats say, look at all the gains we have with women. And they're forgetting that women are only half of the electorate at that time and that they are alienating young men. So it's a net wash for the Democrats. But at the same time, the things that are helping them with their base are alienating moderates of all ages. So the sex and gender extremism and the woke extremism is hurting them across the board, particularly with working class voters who look and say, I don't care about this stuff. My kid's never going to go to college. I just want my kid to move the next rung up on the American ladder to success. And how about talking about what I care about instead of the stuff that all of you friends at your cocktail parties care about? It's hurting them with working class voters, which is why Trump is doing much better with working class voters who are not white. They're beginning to say, hey, I need to vote. These people are more in line with my whole worldview than the party I used to vote for. And the Harris campaign is freaking out and doesn't know how to respond to it.
What's going on with the abortion rhetoric? You got family formation is in rough shape. Cost of raising children is through the roof. You got young women, crying on TikTok about how it costs $200 to get a bag of Doritos and a case of Mountain Dew. The promise of good jobs for young women is really just, you've got girls who are working jobs that are worse than the bad jobs their dads had that made them mad at their dads. And so you've got the Harris campaign, and its surrogate saying like, well, you got to vote for us because abortion. Meanwhile, you look at what's going on the ground with abortion, and yes, states are taking steps to codify abortion rights into a state law. Is that not sinking in with these women voters who are supporting Harris? Are they pretending that it's not going to happen? What does an analysis actually show about how and why that reduction of all of sort of women's issues to abortion is working out?
Yeah, the thing is that abortion rights is a motivating issue for people who are inclined to vote Democrats anyway. So it is a motivating issue to give. It is a motivating issue to volunteer. And if you're inclined to vote Democrat, but you're not always a habitual voter, it is a motivating issue to turn out to the polls. Everyone else, it's a mile wide and an inch deep. So we have yet to see that Republicans, for example, about a third of Republicans are pro-abortion rights. They'll vote for abortion rights initiatives, and they'll vote for Republicans. There's little to no evidence that says it's a party switch issue. I think Democrats overestimate its impact, overestimate its appeal, and consequently are spending time talking about things that matter to people who are already going to vote for them, and a lot less time talking about things to people who used to vote for them and now feel alienated. The African American working class voter, the Hispanic working class voter, the person who wants to get ahead and says it's harder to get ahead now. They're not talking enough about that. That's one of the reasons why Trump is doing well with these groups.
Well, and it might just boil down to the fact that, they had their 4+ years, whatever it is. They took their swing, didn't really work. We didn't have complete catastrophe and meltdown and global thermonuclear war, but things don't seem to be working out very well. There doesn't really seem to be a plan B. They're hanging on to this, looking somewhat competitive right now, but apparently the internals are terrible. Maybe we can talk about that too. But just, sizing things up from where you stand right now, do you expect this campaign, the Harris campaign, to for the bottom to drop out going into the home stretch?
Well, yeah, I think what you'll see is increasingly sharp rhetoric. That, again, what unites their coalition is fear of and anger towards Trump. And you've started to see this in the last week, moving back to the democracy rhetoric that the Biden campaign was running on the he's unstable, he's this, he's that. That the more you see that, the more you see them implicitly saying, we can't sell our vision. We can't defend our record. We have to make them scared of the other person. So we're beginning to see that, and I think it's not that the bottom's falling out, but when tenths of a point matter, the direction that means you're going to win by, win the national popular vote by 1.5 points rather than 2.5 points. That's the difference between the chance to win and probably losing most of the swing states. So I think they are seeing that trend. They want to stop it, and they don't know how to stop it other than by attacking Trump because nothing else seems to work.
Yeah, it seems like we saw that strategy roll out with the Bret Baier interview, which I assume you saw.
Yes.
They spent most of the time talking over each other. But Harris, let's get back to Donald Trump. Let's get back to Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think that is a really good indication is that she chose Fox as the network to make it clear that she's going to define the race in the final days as it's me or that man. And what that means is the abortion messaging, they'll use it, but it's not selling the deal. Open change, new way forward, they'll use it. It's not making the deal. She chose Bret Baier to say, I'm making his character the centerpiece of the campaign and hoping that produces what a positive view of her has not so far produced.
All right, so let's talk about that man, Donald J. Trump. I don't know if I can remember a time when Republicans have been so divided on just their gut feeling, their sense of the odds. Yeah, you had a close race with George W. Bush, but most people were like, we don't know. It's going to come down to the wire. Other than that, it's usually been sort of like wild optimism and a sense of impending total victory, Reagan years, or this kind of like barely a pulse, Romney's going to lose, whatever. This is a lot different. You got some people who are like, yes, this is it. Maybe 22, there was no red wave, but look at these polls. All the trend lines are in our favor. Trump is charismatic. He's confident. He survived these assassination attempts or survived one of them. Mm-hmm. A real feeling of having a real momentum going into the home stretch, and others going, no, it's a game of inches, and you can't read too much of these swing states. He's only up by 0.9%, and then you can't just paint it red. How much of that kind of confusion or disagreement about how this is going to play out is showing up in DC, in the movement? And in the attitudes of the folks on the ground who are really going to have to figure out the turnout thing.
Yeah, I think the more attached, the closer you are to the center of things, the more you're in the inches game. Mm-hmm. I think it's clear that there is movement to Trump, or more accurately, movement away from Harris, and that's why the Harris campaign is flashing the Democrat operatives outside the Harris campaign are saying, be very worried, be very scared, flashing yellow. If you don't turn things around now, things are going to be disastrous. But again, when I take a look at what's happening, when I take a look at the early voting stats, what it looks like is Republicans are turning out to vote, and non-traditional Republican voters are turning out to vote. It's very early, but it looks like the person who may like Trump is an habitual voter, is motivated to vote. Well, that's a good sign for Republicans. And if that keeps up, then I think you could very well be looking at Election Day at another surprise, which is to say that the media will never see a Republican wave until it washes over them at 10 o'clock Eastern time. But wiser people who look at data, the trend lines are good, but you don't want to be too giddy and optimistic and say they're going to continue because there's so much at stake and it's so close. But the trend lines are good, both in the polls and in the early voting numbers that suggest a more pro-Trump movement than the media narrative is letting on. And I think the professionals on their side see it, and that's why you're getting the freak out.
Well, this was sort of the curse of the Democrats for a number of cycles, which is, oh, the youth vote will turn them out. Unlikely voters will save us. There's this sea of people, and you just have to activate them. Does it seem like, though, that unlikely voters are going to break for Trump and that it is going to be significant?
Everyone agrees is that the more engaged you are with politics and the likelier you are to vote, the better, the more you are likely to be for Harris. And that makes sense, is that across the world, voting propensity and engagement with politics rises with formal education. The Democrats are now the elite party. The Democrats are now the party that dominates among people with postgraduate degrees and stuff. So everyone knows that it's better for Trump with the higher turnout, that you get the person who doesn't consume politics, doesn't look at the Real Clear Politics poll average, but may or may not vote. And what we're seeing is, again, it's early, what we're seeing is it looks like that person is engaging in voting. And if that continues, then what you'll see is a bunch of polls that built into their models an assumption, well, low income, low education voters who may lean to Trump aren't going to vote. The trend line suggests that those will be wrong, in which case the polls will be proven wrong on election day. And I think that's the sort of thing that's freaking the Democrats out. And they know also that Harris isn't where she needs to be with blacks. She isn't where she needs to be with Latinos. She needs higher degrees of support and higher degrees of engagement. And when you're talking about a core element of your base for 30, 40 years that's not giving you that margin 2 weeks before election time, that's reason for freak out. I mean, if Trump was talking about evangelical Christians, oh my gosh, Trump is only winning 2/3 of evangelical Christians. He needs 80%. So he's got to go to churches. He's got to talk about God. Republicans would be freaking out. They're not seeing that with their base. Democrats are seeing that with their non-white base, and that's freaking them out. And there's a reason they should be freaked out.
You know, back in 2016, I found myself in this weird spot as kind of a commentator guy where people were freaking out about Donald Trump, but that didn't start happening until like fairly late in the race. I'm old enough to remember when, those think pieces were coming out and it's like, no, Marco Rubio is the real extremist and Donald Trump is this kind of squishy New York guy. All that changed, almost overnight. And so I was out there trying to make the point of like Donald Trump is a normal human being and like a normal candidate and there's no reason for the freak out. But at the same time, the campaign itself was so bad. Once Bannon kind of got in there and got some control over it, it was still pretty bad. And so I was the guy who said, like, look, the convention shouldn't throw him out because he's a danger to democracy. If anything, they should throw him out because he's obviously not trying to win. So there have always been these criticisms about Trump and about his campaign style and about his campaign managers, and they come and they go, and sometimes they come back. And, the current crop was really feeling the heat just a couple of months ago. Oh, they're sabotaging the campaign. They former never Trumpers. You can't trust these guys. You got to throw them out. You got to bring in the professionals. Bust Bannon out of prison and put him back in the charge of the campaign. But now the Trump campaign team is looking pretty clever. What happened?
What happened was people stopped reacting to momentary changes, and Trump didn't panic. This is the most professional campaign that Trump has run out of the three campaigns that he's run. Harris came in and was boosted by a Democratic desire to win, and of course the uncritical media attention, and that inflated her numbers as she consolidated wavering Democrats, people who didn't like Trump but really thought Biden was too old or too incompetent. And that led to a freakout when there was nothing wrong that was going on. Nothing wrong that was going on. And so now we're back to normal, which is say that the honeymoon phase is over for Harris and people are beginning to settle down. And Trump kept his head about him. He kept his campaign staff moving along. He focused himself a little bit better than he was in the initial weeks afterwards. I think he's settled on themes to attack her on and themes to promote him on. And he's better. His campaign never wavered, and Trump didn't blow up the bus. And I think Not panicking when there was a little bit of a squall was the right thing to do. And look, this is a jump ball election, but the trend lines are slowly in Trump's favor. And if that continues, then we should expect a media freakout on Tuesday night, election night. But again, 2 weeks to go, lots of things can change.
Do you think his brush with death on that stage at that rally made him a better candidate?
No, I don't. I think he is who he is. He had a moment where he could have embraced a rethink, embraced a softer side that could have moved, again, a point or so. But in the race this close, that could have been the difference. He is who he is. He is a candidate with enormous advantages. He is somebody who can set a narrative and dominate the media like nobody we've seen. He's somebody who knows how to cut through and energize people. He is also sharply polarizing. The assassination attempt could have given him a chance to sand down a little of the polarizing while keeping his advantages. He didn't do it. He is an enormously gifted candidate who also has some flaws, and that's who he is, and that's the horse that Republican Party is going to ride into Election Day with.
Yeah, to me, I mean, one of the most amazing things about Trump is this kind of polarity that sometimes comes out. One of these moments, he goes and sees the truckers, and he climbs into the truck, and he's sort of sitting there, and I'm paraphrasing, but basically he says he's like, yeah, I lived a good life, like all kinds of crazy stuff happened to me, and sometimes I wish I could just like take this truck and just drive it off into the sunset, but I'm not going to do it. And there are other times you see him in his speeches, and he does have this incredible softness that comes out in the voice and the hands, and then he goes right in for the kill, and that swing back and forth is just so powerful. And there was a moment where it seemed like he was going to sort of soften things and become a little more reflective, a little more introspective, but it didn't last. It seems like it never does.
Yeah, that's the thing, is it never does. He is who he is, and you dance with the lady what brung you, and Donald Trump has produced something that 12 years ago Republican strategists wanted, but their strategy would not have accomplished, which is if we were sitting here in 2012, you're looking at a world which is just like the last century. Democrats have a partisan edge, and in the post-Reagan era, 5 to 8 points more people say they're Democrats than Republicans. The Trump era was supposed to, in the media's eyes and the experts' eyes, usher in a wave of Democratic dominance. In fact, we are now in the most Republican electorate in the last century. He has not yet brought Republicans to the promised land of majority status, but he has taken them out of the bondage of Egypt, of Democratic partisan edge. And you got to say, that's due in part to his genius. That he has found a way to drive millions, tens of millions of people away from the Democratic camp and made them open to voting for Republicans. He's driven a few million away from the Republican camp, so it's not a dominance that you might have hoped for, but it's an enormous accomplishment, and it's due to a man who is willing to break China in order to get things to happen. And it's amazing to see how he's accomplished it. And if he wins, he could very well enter the promised land and bring Republicans what they've dreamed of for a century, which is being the real default majority, not just an occasional majority.
Well, and it's fascinating because the electorate has changed and continues to change dramatically. One of the big cases against Trump, just sort of analytically, was all these boomers are going to die off, and the electorate's going to skew young, and all the young people are going to do what the Dems always want them to do, which is just vote Democrat, you straight up and down the ticket. That hasn't really happened, but the electorate has grown. We could say coarser, I guess. The culture has grown coarser. The Republicans wanted that outright majority, but they kept putting up these guys, fresh out of the country club, dining hall or whatever. And yet Trump really hasn't changed. He's the same guy as he was in the 80s. You go back and watch the tapes, and he's kind of making the same points. We're getting killed out there. The competition, we're not living up. And that message is really translating now among a coarser electorate. I'm a Alexis de Tocqueville scholar in a previous life. I don't have a problem with coarse Americans. Tocqueville's out there saying like the elites look down on these people, and they're sort of disgusted trying to watch them solve their own problems. And so they want to take away all of the tools and just impose the problems from the top. You got to let people sort of struggle through it and figure figure out how to govern themselves. That seems to be Trump's style, even if he hasn't really, I don't think, had the opportunity to govern in a way where you can say, this is more than Trump's style. This is how he actually governs as a politician. This is really, he's the least experienced politician that we've had in ages. But how do you think those demographics actually are going to play out as we head into November and then going through, there's going to be another election cycle and not that long.
We are in the permanent election cycle, aren't we? The thing is that I'm in my early 60s. And as long as I've been alive, Pepsi has been the voice of a new generation. Every couple of years, it's always the same message. Yeah. And the Democrats are the Pepsi of politics. It's always going to be the youth. But what they forget is that youth gets older. And people who vote when they're 18, don't vote when they're 18, do vote when they're 45. And those people tend to be more conservative. That the sort of person who isn't excited by politics when they're 19, but when they're responsible, they have a family, they decide to start voting, those people tend to be more conservative than the people who are excited at voting when you're 18. And so what happens is this misplaced idea that we're going to change personalities. We're going to change the way 18 to 24-year-olds look at politics. Never works. They think abortion is going to be their cutting issue this time. Maybe on the margin, but it's not going to change the basic nature of things. And the basic nature of things, too, is that this is the least white 18 to 24 generation in history. And increasingly, the white, elite-dominated progressive Democratic Party are saying to 18 to 20-year-olds, vote on the things that we care about. But the 18 to 24-year-olds are not those people. The 18 to 24-year-olds is the son of a Hispanic truck driver or the son of an African-American factory worker. And they are motivated by white, progressive, college-educated issues. And they're saying, why should I vote for that? And that means that younger people of color are moving more to the Republican Party that is talking about those issues. So the Democrats' misplaced focus and lack of understanding of the youth vote could very well be what costs them this election. And they, again, will never see it coming till it comes and knocks them over like a Mack truck.
Well, speaking of youth and age, for a guy in his 60s, your head of hair must be the envy of Washington. Certainly something Donald Trump would respect. There's another dynamic I want to get into here and spend a little bit of time.
And no hair plugs, no dye.
Yeah, that's all natty, baby. That's an achievement all by itself in 2024. You may have seen this kind of, I don't know if you describe it as a graph or a sort of heat map or something, showing kind of partisan distribution in business or in tech. And it's been morphing, and last time around, tech was pretty blue. And now this time there's like this trough in the middle, or what is described as the middle. And you got a lot of tech guys skewing left, and then now suddenly a lot of tech guys skewing right. Obviously, Elon Musk is literally on the ground in Pennsylvania, right, doing the campaigning. He's got the dark MAGA hat. He's got the gold MAGA hat. I know, this is kind of anecdotal, but I'm sure if you ran some numbers on it, you'd find this to be true. A lot of these kind of movement conservative guys who have been in the movement for a long time, sort of professional conservatives, really feeling the heat. These tech guys roll in and they say, you know what, I'm going to align myself with these issues, and then I'm going to own these issues. And you guys, with your chicken dinners and your yellow ties, we don't actually need you anymore. Trump is our guy now. That might be, it's maybe a little too early to tell, but there's only so much runway. We're going to figure out one way or the other. That tech swing to support Trump 2.0, I think, is significant. I'm not sure how much it's driving polling or moving those kind of blue collar guys, but blue collar guys know tech too, and they know how it can help and they know how it can hurt. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is indicative of a couple of things. First of all, tech has always tended to be entrepreneurial and socially libertarian, which in some ways cuts against a Republican position on the social libertarian side. But on the other hand, this is the thing that Musk talks about. They really care about things like free speech. They really care about that. And they look over at the left and they say, wait a minute, the side I thought was defending me is actually the side that's oppressing me. They're the ones who are saying, I can't do this. They're the ones who are saying, I shouldn't say this. And that's driving a lot of them to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe I need to take a look at these other people because they defend me and protect what I really, really care about. And then you've got the entrepreneurial side, which is they need to have people who understand the need to take risks. And when you take a look at a managerial, again, the more progressive you get, the more they want a top-down approach to the economy. Government plans doing this, government plans doing that. And they look and they say, wait a minute, the people who I thought defended me as the entrepreneur of the future actually says, we don't want you to be an entrepreneur. And so, yeah, on the margin, these are things that help. And particularly, you've got a living embodiment of that, Vivek Ramaswamy, who did best in the Republican primaries and caucuses with younger conservatives, presumably the sort that are tech-friendly. And I think you'll see that show up a little bit on election day, but particularly more in the future as you see who cares about free speech, who cares about people taking risks. It's likelier to be in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and over time, that's going to matter.
Is there enough attention being paid to the shifts of political opinion on the internet, sort of hiding in social media? It doesn't always show up. It's not like Frank Luntz sits down with 10 anonymous accounts from X.com and sort of asks them. It's kind of a different thing, and it does seem like there is kind of this pool of support for Trump, and maybe even for like a more enhanced or accelerated version of Trump that isn't showing up in the discourse. You get it in some of these sort of worried think pieces coming out of the Atlantic or wherever. They're fascists and they want Trump to be the sort of space lord of America. I don't know. Half that stuff is joking anyway, I think. But is it making it harder to really capture kind of what's going on with that generation, with the tech industry, with those trends?
The thing is that the legacy media is losing power. Is that, when I was growing up, information was expensive. You had to pay things to get it. Yeah. You didn't get it immediately. And it went through gatekeepers, your editors at newspapers, your editors at magazines, your editors or your producers or your executives at networks. And today it's inexpensive, it's virtually free, it's immediate, and there's no gatekeepers. So you want to take a look, and the legacy media is used to setting a narrative, and they can't set a narrative anymore. But it's also harder to figure out a narrative because there's so many places to look. If I was going to say, well, look at the discussion that's going on X. Well, that's a subpart. Look at the discussion that's going on the Daily Kos. Well, that's a subpart. The thing is that it's such a wide range of places where people congregate, get information, and share information. It's hard to say there's a singular narrative. Just like when I was growing up, TV shows on the networks would get 30% of America tune in. The Roots miniseries got 50%, literally 50% of America turning. Yeah. Nowadays, a network hit gets 14 million people. You would get canceled with that before. And it's because it's not that people are consuming the media less, it's that there's so many more options, so many more sub things that are going on. So yeah, there's a tech subculture, that's significant, that is not being covered, but it's just one of many subcultures. It's just hard to say what America is talking about because Americans are talking about so many different things and so many different fora.
And so now you get candidates going on podcasts that a lot of people have never heard of, but these podcasts are doing millions of numbers that put the cable networks to shame.
That's right. But then again, there's going to be 150 to 160 million votes cast. You go on Charlemagne to God, and maybe you reach 1 million or 2 million people. That's a crucial 2 million people.
Yeah.
It's 1% of the electorate. It used to be when you had 3 networks that commanded 60% of the electorate, you knew where to go and you talked to most everybody. Now you have to seek out all these different ways to reach the subgroups where people congregate. So yeah, Joe Rogan, Charlemagne to God, all these little podcasts, they have passionate followers. They have passionate people. You need to go where the voters are. And it's a small subset. You have to add all these things up. And that's what candidates are realizing. It's a lot harder to be a candidate now because you actually have to talk to lots of different outlets, lots of different things that have all of their different styles and different concerns. Trump seems to be good at it. Harris is in a learning curve.
Yeah, so as an exennial, as I guess I would be classified, sort of micro generation between
Yeah.
the millennials and the Xers. Fascinating place to be. I must say, it's been a trip. I think a lot of guys kind of that in that age bracket have been trying to stay young because they keep waiting for it to be their turn to govern, and a lot of that energy is kind of going to Trump for that reason. But even so, my experience it's been crazy where it's like the rising generations don't exist until one day they're everywhere. So like, for my version of this is going to the coffee shop to like, do the laptop thing and like write or whatever, work on the book manuscript. And it seemed like forever, every barista was a millennial. And being just on the other side of that generational divide, I felt like, man, I sort of struggle to relate to these people. And then one day, I'm still not sure exactly what day it was, but it felt like there was one day and suddenly all the baristas were Zoomers. And for some reason that I'm still trying to unpack, I feel like there's this kind of generational synergy between the Zoomers and the Xers that isn't present between the Xers and the Boomers or the Millennials. And so I'm wondering, like, as someone who's kind of analyzing these waves and these trends and watching these election cycles go and go and go, are you starting to feel like the Zoomers have now ascended to the level where they're really politically relevant? Because I think a lot of that's behind what's going on with those podcasts.
Yeah, well, they're politically relevant, but they're not politically dominant. That's the thing is that you take a look, and the single biggest group in the electorate is still the Boomer generation. And the second biggest group in the electorate is the X generation. So, yeah, you have to pay attention to the Zoomers. They consume media differently. You see it in all the polls that the Zoomer generation is much likelier to be totally online and disconnected with the sorts of media that the Boomer generation still follows. But they're still only a segment of the electorate. And if you're in that hip tech world, it feels bigger to you. But when you're in the broad, I got to talk to 160 million votes, the fact is the median age of a voter this year will be somewhere in their 40s.
Yeah.
And if you're in a primary, I look at these data all the time. The median age of a voter in a Republican primary, depending on the state, is between 60 and 65. The median age. Mm-hmm. So, yes, it's real. Yes, the campaigns are beginning to recognize that. But the bulk of the voter class is still the sort of person who grew up with legacy media, consume legacy media, and are much less likely to be the person who goes and goes on their laptop in a Starbucks or a Dutch Bros.
I remember the first time, I think it might have been the New York Times, one of those, maybe Washington Post, someone writing this frantic column about, we now have Americans entering the electorate who don't remember how terrible Donald Trump was. They're born after 9/11. They just don't get it. It's like they're not even thinking about it. And it's like, yes, time rolls on.
Yeah, look, I teach, and so I'm always in front of young people, and my cultural touchstones are not their cultural touchstones. But if I'm running a campaign, what I have to remember is I have to talk to them. And I have to talk to people like me, and I have to talk to everybody in between. Donald Trump sometimes makes cultural references to Mad Magazine, which people in his generation and down to like the 60s or 50s recognize. Zoomers have no idea what he's talking about.
Even though it's still around.
Because it doesn't matter the way it mattered when you were younger.
Yeah, it was the only game in town.
It was the only satirical game in town, right? And now life has moved on.
Yeah.
But that's the thing is that the memories and the experiences of the older people still matter because there's still tens of millions of them too. And that's what's to remember is that, yes, there's this new thing out there. Yes, you have to pay attention to it. But the bulk of America is still the old. It's going to take another 20 years for enough of that to die off and enough of the people who grew up in the online era to be the dominant as opposed to simply a new, growing, influential part of the electorate.
Okay, so you teach college age?
I do, yes.
Okay, it's sort of like the ultimate focus group if they're willing to play ball. I know that a lot of kids are at this point just sort of like sitting there, disconnected, not engaging, waiting to go home and tell the computer to write the essay. If your students are not that way, what kind of vibes are you picking up from them right about now?
Yeah, well, the sort of, I'm not in the classroom right now. I was in the classroom last semester. And what I was picking up from them was, again, You've got some people who are there for the grade and some people who are just passionate about politics and everybody in between. What they were picking, what that class I was getting was reflection of the issues then. There was a lot of talk about Hamas and Israel. I was very passionate for them. But one of the things I find with young people, and I was in 2016 teaching a class, and again, a wide variety of opinion, Republicans versus Democrats, and the fact that they signed up for my class, which was an elective, and they're already more politically interested. They had a hard time recognizing that they weren't the center of the universe. Mm-hmm. It's like just saying, hey, guess what? The way to win is not simply to talk to you. You have to talk to you, and you have to talk to them, and you have to talk to them. And that's what I try and talk about in all my classes is if you want to win a national election, what you have to do is be coalitional. You can't just be factional. You can't just talk to a small, narrow group, because guess what? If 10% of the country loves you passionately, but none of the rest of the country knows about you or cares about you, you're a loser. I like to say that in business, a 45% market share makes you a billionaire. In politics, a 45% market share makes you a loser. And that's what you have to understand as a candidate. And young people don't instinctively understand it. They think the world is focused on them, ought to be focused on them. I thought that when I was 19, mm-hmm. But it's not. And that's one of the things I try in my classes to import, and to take a broader look at things. And but naturally, that's not natural to them.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy to me, at least, to see people who think that they're the center of the universe supporting Hamas, which is something that would be utterly out of the question in America. People get worried about criticism about Israel, and it's like, well, okay, America runs on criticism. It's the internet. Everyone gets criticized on the internet. No one is safe from the attacks. But right. To go that extra mile to say, like, I'm actually affirmatively for Hamas. Do you think that kind of stuff is going to continue to happen with younger generations and change the face of politics?
Yeah, well, the thing is, again, this is me looking back. There's always a segment of the young generation that likes to protest and that likes to focus on an out issue. Sanctions in South Africa, it's Occupy Wall Street or something. It's always a segment. It never dominates, because the broader stretch of America has other concerns. So this is particularly horrendous because of the cause that many of them are embracing. You're talking about a group of people who murdered 1,200 people for no other point than ethnic hatred. You don't have to love what Israel does in regards to the West Bank to think that murdering people for the sake of their ethnicity is wrong. Can we agree on that? And if you can't see that, that's a problem. But as far as the phenomena of a group of young people who are interested in campus demonstrations and show cause on a fringe issue, that's a recurring feature of American life that seems to be like a perennial flower. It comes up and it dies in the wintertime.
Yeah, I'm always most interested not in who you're criticizing, but what are you for? What are you actually affirmatively for? And
that's the thing, is these things tend to be negative rather than affirmative.
Yeah, that's right. And so looking at that and looking at just kind of whether it's with tech or whether it's with the kind of intersectionality stuff, just trying to understand what are the actual factions here, not in terms of who they're criticizing, but what is the non-negotiable for them, what they're actually for. There's a big chunk of the electorate that used to have a very clear identity and used to be, maybe not totally monolithic, but, pretty reliably consistent in their approach and how they come down on the issues. And that's the religious right. And you fast forward to 2024, a lot of people on the right who have a problem with Trump have been kind of a chunk of the religious right, or, this guy's not a real Christian. He doesn't really go to church. He's waving the Bible around, but look at the words they use. The religious right has really just kind of melted or broken up into these different pods. And I'm sort of curious, just for your kind of overall assessment of like what has become of the religious right, and what does its future look like in politics today?
I think when I was young, the religious right came into being around the idea that they were the moral majority. That was Jerry Falwell's group. Today, the religious right recognizes that they're the moral minority. They used to think, okay, the problem is there's a minority elite that is taking away the majority of people's views to regulate their lives. That's what we are about. They're very afraid now. They're conscious that they are a minority. They're conscious that they have even less influence in major institutions, and what they want is protection. That's why, for all of the leaders who will kvetch about Trump, and there are very prominent, very sincere Christians who are leaders of the Never Trump movement, the vast bulk of serious traditional Christians, the religious right, if you will vote for him. And will vote for him enthusiastically because what they want now is protection. They want protection from a culture they think is trying to exterminate them. They want protection from an elite that they think is trying to erode and eliminate their liberty to practice their faith, not just to worship in church, but to practice their faith. And that's why you have a lot of people who wish that Trump were more pro-life, but they're going to enthusiastically back them because when push comes to shove, what they want is protection rather than the affirmation and the advancement of their particular worldview because they think that's the best deal they can get. So you're going to look at the exit polls and they'll show what the pre-polls are, which is Trump will get near record highs, if not get record highs, among people who are evangelical Christians, among people who go to church regularly. He will continue the generational shift of regular church-going Christians into the Republican Party, particularly if you're an evangelical Christian. That's his strongest bloc among Latinos, is evangelical Christians are the strongest pro-Republican bloc among the Latino subset. I like to say that if you want to make the Latino population Republican, don't argue about issues, convert them to go to a Pentecostal church. It just changes their worldview and changes their voting proclivity. So that's because they want protection, and that's a sea change from 20 years ago when they thought they could win victory.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because you go back 20 years and you look at what's the religious right agenda. What do they come out with and say, we're for this, and that's who we are, and that's why we should have more power, or you should support us, or whatever. And it was prayer in school, and it was enshrine pro-life into the Constitution. It was display the Ten Commandments. It was all that kind of stuff that was just like every day in political news. And you fast forward to today, and what is it? And it's, the dynamic has changed. It does seem like they want protection, and they're looking for some other way of characterizing their political identity. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of these guys, what do they lead with? We are pro-Israel. We need to stand up for Israel. These are our allies. This is the Holy Land. That's really been a transformation.
Yeah, and it's also religious liberty. You talk all about the guy who wouldn't bake the cake. And is continually in support.
Masterpiece Cake Shop, yeah.
Right, yeah. It's like, we need protection. We need to be able to practice our faith, which is, I'm not going to say you shouldn't be able to go out and get married, even though I might want to vote against same-sex marriage if that were a live issue. But at least let me live my life. Mm-hmm. If you're going to live yours, let me live my life. And there's a lot of people where they are a majority or near majority influence, they do enact more of their values. You do have pro-life legislation in southern states. You do have I think Louisiana is passing a law to post the Ten Commandments in schools, and we'll see whether or not that gets through the Supreme Court. But nationally, they know that they're in a minority. Nationally, they're in defense mode, and they believe Donald Trump is going to be Horatio at the bridge, that he's going to be the shining knight that's going to protect them from the dragon that's coming down on the killing of the city.
Yeah, really fascinating because, if you do convert Latinos to Pentecostalism and it causes them to vote Republican, at the same time, they are sort of abandoning this kind of traditional protection that those traditional conservative voters would find in a strong and ancient church, with those patronage networks. And we saw the Italians and the Irish kind of running these plays, and that was kind of the model for that kind of the old religious right, sort of pre-evangelicalism. But now you get churches that might be 20 years old, 30 years old, 10 days old, who knows? That kind of religious environment is one where you do need more political protection than maybe traditional, conservatives would have needed in the past.
It's also a different world, is that the power of the state and the attempt of the state to get into private institutions is much greater than it was 100 years ago, Yeah. And so when you're talking about whether or not institutions that are affiliated with the church can enforce the church's liturgical and confessional doctrine in the running of that institution. Can a Christian college, do they have to admit same-sex couples into their college and allow them to have the same dorm rights as they would to a heterosexual married couple. Well, that's a live issue in a way it wasn't 100 years ago, and it's the civil rights laws, but also the use of federal power. What would happen if a Harris administration said you can't do that and still be in receipt of federal student loan money? That wasn't an issue 100 years ago. It is an issue today, and that's why you have this massive concern with protection rather than organization. And then the sheer entrepreneurialness of the modern evangelical community is that you in a denominational world, the denomination sets up where the church is, and usually, not always, assigns the pastor. The energy on the religious right is in the non-denominational world, where it's very pastor-driven, it's very entrepreneurial. They set up their own churches, they attract their own flock. Churches pop up and they pop down depending on that. That too lends itself to a certain Republican leaning, because in a world where the progressive left wants to have a greater state domination of the economy, that naturally means they want to have more control over the social institutions. You see it, we want to have disinformation outlawed. Well, what is disinformation? Except government planning that is extended to the information sphere. And so a religious community that relies on freedom, entrepreneurialism, and free speech wants to be protected from that. So have the religious nature of the religious community lends itself in a way to a different type of politics than a century ago.
Yeah, this stuff is so important. It's worth an hour all on its own. But I just want to pick out the point that you made, which is so crucial, I think, of just how dramatic and really it's become central to the left idea of governance, of what governance is for, to really invade the basic prerogatives of free exercise of religion. You go back to the Roman Empire days, and you got the 40 martyrs, and why were the 40 martyrs martyred? They were loyal the citizens of Rome. They were subjects to the emperor. They respected the emperor and the empire, and they were soldiers, and they fought for the empire. And so how did they end up in a freezing lake dying for Christ, right? And it was because it was demanded of them that they, in fact, demonstrate publicly that they were worshiping the gods of the empire.
Yeah, and the thing is that this is the great fear among evangelical Christians that we're Rod Dreher talks about this, is that in the 4th century AD, you move from the freedom of the Christian church to the abolition of paganism at the end of the century. And he says, we're like the pagans. That we're about ready over the next century to move to being outlawed. And what basically evangelical Christians are saying, no, we're afraid of that. We want to have we want our freedom of religion respected. We want our freedom of speech respected. And that is a motivational issue for them, because they fear, and not incorrectly, that a confessional state that is geared towards modern sensibilities will eventually treat them like the pagans of the 4th century and close their temples and their worship and eventually drive them out of existence.
I think I'll make this last question just to tie myself off before we go off for another hour, if for nothing else. Making that comparison to the pagans, I think really what hurt the pagans was they were worshiping many gods. And sure, they had the empire, but they were also, they're almost sort of like, Protestants today, where there are all these different sub-denominations. It's really hard to herd the cats. It's really hard to get everyone on the same page. And even if you do get them on the same page, well, next time around, it might change. The landscape might transform. There are problems with retention rates. It's a very fluid situation. And if you have one sort of group of people who's really dedicated to unifying their worship and their understanding of the interplay between politics and theology, they can really just cut through, kind of that jumble of coalition. I mean, the left has this problem with intersectionality. I think the right's got a version of this problem on what's become the religious right. And so, what I want to ask is, you've got Democrats looking in some ways more fractured than they have been in a long time. You look at the Jewish electorate, more fractured than it's been in a very long time, maybe forever. You look at the right, also terribly fractured. I was going to mention this earlier. Reason magazine, they do their endorsements. 0 Reason editors endorse Donald Trump. And these are libertarians. Parties becoming more libertarian. What's going on? So the question is, everyone looks like they're becoming more fractured right now politically. Do you think that one of these major two parties is going to crack in a serious way before the other?
Before the election? No. But
not before the election, but first, before the other party.
It's hard to say which will. The thing is that what happens in American politics is you go through a period where one party answers a pressing political question in a definitive way and sets the agenda for the next 40, 50 years or so. That's what Thomas Jefferson did. It was a very close, bitterly fought election of 1800. Yeah. Basically, his party ran the country for the next 60 years. They defined the agenda, and the Whigs or the Federalists or were what political scientists called the Moon Party, circling. The Sun Party was the Jefferson. And then the Republicans to settle the question of slavery. And they were the dominant party for 72 years. Democrats could win elections from time, but the agenda was set by Republicans and so forth. We're going through that right now. And it's messy. One party will win eventually, sooner rather than later for the health of the country, peacefully rather than non-peacefully for the health of the country. And then they will set the agenda. And it's not clear which party's going to be. But they all have their challenges. They all have their issues. The thing about the Democratic Party that I want to focus on, since Republican divisions are highlighted in the media every day,
right,
is that since 1932, the Democratic Party has been beset by an argument that I say is between the transformative and the reformative. Is America a good country but needs to be reformed, or is America a problematic country that needs to be transformed? And in 1948, there were two parties that argued. There was the Progressive Party of Henry Wallace that split off from the Democratic Party, saying, we are the heirs of Franklin Roosevelt. And if you ever want to see a real left-wing platform, read that, because they actually call for government nationalization, government economic planning, and so forth. They said America needs to be transformed. Harry Truman said America needs to be reformed, and their platform was much more social programs, but not government planning. Fast forward to today, the transformationalists on a cultural issue, on an economic issue, are stronger within the Democratic Party than they have ever been. The reformative are barely holding on with the majority. This is an alliance that has to blow up sometime. The way it's been kept together is the reformative side has won all the internal primaries for president, and they adapt by moving closer to the transformative side, but they don't adopt it. At some point, the transformative side is going to win a primary. Their candidate's going to be the nominee, and that party will blow up. Because you can't be for radical transformation and still be in connection with the center of the American politics. And then when that happens, it's a great opportunity for Republicans if they know how to respond to it. The Democratic Party is a simmering pot that the temperature is going up and up and up, and the lid of the establishment still winning the primary keeps it down. At some point, that lid's just going to blow open, and we'll see what's really going on, and it's going to be a real explosive mess.
Incisive analysis, as always. I know I will be reading Come What May. Henry Olsen, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, James.
All right, that's all the time we got. Till next time around, I am James Poulos. This is Zero Hour, and may God have mercy on us all.